Yo, what's popping, Jimbos? I'm back. This time with a series of guides about game mechanics. I'll be using these videos as a reference point in future guides. I'll be talking about mechanics such as wall blocking, aggro, including how gaining and losing aggro works, as well as some quick bowling tricks, glitchy mob behavior, targeting, and more. First, I'll explain how each mechanic works, what are the conditions for executing it properly, and then I'll show you some examples of it in Underworld Speed. This video in particular will be about aggro, as it is one of the most basic mechanics in the game. Aggro is a term used to relate to the enemy's ability to see the player's character, which allows them to follow, attack, and use skills on him. It's important to know that aggro is shared between all enemies in a group, which means that if your character gains aggro of one of the enemies, all the rest of the group will also be caught. There's a few different ways of acquiring aggro. The main way is to enter, as in run into, the enemy's aggro bubble. Aggro bubble is a term used to describe the zone around every entity. It's that grey translucent circle around your character on the compass. When using this way of obtaining aggro, the center of the red dot on your compass has to be inside of your aggro bubble for the enemy to notice your character. When using other ways, this is not the case, which I'll point out later. Next, corpse aggro. It's important to note that enemy corpses also have aggro bubbles. Entering it will aggro any living member of that foe's group. Usually corpses can be recognized by the grey dots on your compass or by the body of the enemy laying on the ground. In this clip I'm killing a collector that is in the same party with 3 threshers. After I've done so, I break aggro of the threshers, which you can tell by them returning to their original position on the compass. Pay attention to the grey dot on the minimap. As soon as I enter the aggro of the corpse left by the dead collector, the threshers aggro onto me again immediately. Not all enemies leave corpses though. For example, when a nightmare dies, it leaves no trace behind it. As you can see in this clip, the LT is killing 2 nightmares that are a part of 2 separate grasping groups. Even though there is no visible corpse on the ground or the minimap, when I run through the area where they've been killed, the remaining party members of those nightmares aggro onto me as well. That's why it's important to pay attention to where enemies are being killed. Another way of obtaining aggro of enemies is by performing a ranged attack or a skill on them. The range that you can do it from is slightly bigger than your aggro bubble, and it's known as casting range. Casting range also applies to using skills on your allies, but about that a bit later. The red dot doesn't even have to be touching the outline of your aggro bubble for you to be able to perform these actions. Notice how the 60 armor dummy is way outside of my aggro circle, yet I'm still able to cast my hexes and other skills on it. It's important to mention that different weapons like a staff, bow, or a spear have different ranges of basic attacks. Basic attacks of a staff are of the same range as casting range. Long or flat bows have the longest range out of all the weapons in the game. Their attack range increases when the target is below the attacker and decreases when it is above. Wielding a flat bow allows you to attack enemies from way further away from your aggro bubble, if your character is elevated in relation to your target. The attack can miss, be blocked, or be dodged and still catch aggro of the enemy. If the projectile gets obstructed, however, the target will not catch aggro. This is a very common occurrence during the T1 quest. Spear has short enough range that your character will run into the enemy's aggro bubble before you even get the chance to attack them. Next on the list is chain aggro. Chain aggro is a term used to describe a situation where more than one group of enemies aggros onto the player, even though he interacted with only one of them. Chain aggro occurs under specific circumstances. It only works when the enemies are of the same type and are within a close range of each other, slightly less than aggro bubble range. Here's a list of same type enemies in the Underworld. Some of them look the same or very similar to each other, which is more intuitive, but others are completely different. Sometimes you wouldn't expect them to be the same type and therefore chain aggro, like for example a dying nightmare and a bladed ache. In lab, chain aggro happens almost every time when you're playing as lab tank. When the player comes in contact with one of the groups, all the nearby groups aggro onto him as well. Important note, you can chain aggro through any of the previously mentioned ways of gaining aggro, like running into aggro bubble or corpse aggro, etc., but not through chain aggro itself, which essentially means that if you gain aggro of group 1, which chains aggro group 2 does not chain aggro of group 3 anymore. Another way of obtaining aggro is by taking damage from an enemy attack or spell. It is quite rare, but nonetheless worth mentioning. This happens when your character sustains damage from an enemy that's not even in your aggro bubble. For example, when a Terrorweb uses Lava Font and gets pulled away by a tank, and you stand on top of it while the skill is still in effect, you catch aggro of the Terrorweb and his group. On the final note about gaining aggro, it's important to remember that spirits like Winnowing or EOE and Summoning Stones act as an extension to the player's aggro, as they have their own aggro bubbles just like any other entity. This means that anything that catches aggro of your spirit or your Summoning Stone also has aggroed onto you as well. Before we move on to the part about breaking aggro, first I'll talk about sharing aggro. Aggro is defined as shared when more than one player has aggro of a specific enemy or a group of enemies. This is generally a bad thing because it makes mobs behave in an unpredictable way. When aggro is shared between players, enemies will try to attack all of them, which makes them impossible to pull up. They will constantly run and switch between targets, resulting in total chaos. The enemy AI chooses whom to attack at a particular moment based on many different factors. Those factors are not certain, but evidence suggests that it involves armor ratings, current health, movement speed or state, whether you're running or standing still, distance, using skills, whether you're wielding a caster or a martial weapon, and how much damage you're dealing. How does shared aggro take place? Let's say player 1 already has aggro of a group of enemies. Logically, player 2 can gain aggro of the same group of enemies by using any of the previously mentioned ways of obtaining aggro, like by running into enemies' aggro bubble or using skills on them. That way, both players have aggro of the same group of enemies, which defines it as shared. It's possible for player 2 to aggro the same group of enemies as player 1 without interacting with the enemies themselves, but interacting with the player holding them instead. Interacting refers to casting skills on his character. Maintaining bonds casted before the target player gains aggro of enemies does not share that aggro of the caster. Now that we know how to gain aggro of enemies, it would be good to know how to lose it. Keep in mind that the following information about the conditions and ways of breaking aggro is not only useful for doing so, but it also teaches you how to prevent aggro from breaking. Breaking aggro or losing aggro means escaping from a group of foes so they break off and stop attacking and following the player. When that happens, the enemies return to what they were doing before gaining their aggro, whether they were patrolling, standing still, or roaming around. Depending on which one of those three states they were in when the player aggroed them, they will break differently. Which brings me to the first way of breaking aggro, which is by pulling enemies far away from their original aggro point. Most mobs in the game will eventually stop following the player and return to their original aggro point when enough distance has been made between where they currently are and where they were aggroed. The distance required for the enemies to break differs from mob type to mob type, but also, as I just mentioned, it depends on what they were doing before the player aggroed them. When you aggro mobs when they're patrolling, they'll follow you the furthest. It's called good aggro, and it's usually the most useful when balling up different groups of enemies from one big area. When you aggro enemies when they're roaming around, they will follow you reasonably far, but not as far as on good aggro though, and it's called normal aggro. When you aggro foes when they're standing still or in the process of grouping up after roaming, they won't follow you almost at all. It's called bad aggro for that exact reason. You're not able to comfortably pull them around. In pits, when playing ST4, you kill the bottom group simply because that particular group is always standing still when you approach it. Another way to break aggro is to obtain a certain amount of movement speed. Different enemies break aggro at different movement speed values, but some don't break from it at all. In speed clears, almost in all cases, everyone is under the effect of a BU and Cupcake, which increases the player's movement by 33%, which is the cap. The only way to go above that cap can be achieved by the use of a single skill that grants you 50% movement speed, like Pious Haste, Burning Speed, or most commonly in speed clears, Dash. It's important to mention that changing the way your character is running also affects your movement speed. When running sideways or backwards, your movement speed is reduced by 25 and 33% respectively. On this chart you can see all the enemies in the Underworld that break aggro when running forward with a cupcake and a concert. This information can be used for the exact opposite reason, which is maintaining aggro. For example, when you're playing as LT in main team, you want to keep aggro of all the Nightmares and Mind Blades. In order to do that, you have to move slower than 33% movement speed not to break them, which you can do by either running sideways, which is not very comfortable if you have to do it for an extended period of time, or simply by not using a cupcake at the beginning of the run. Back to breaking aggro. When the right amount of movement speed has been achieved for the particular mob type to break, initially the enemies just stop chasing the player and return to their original aggro point instead. But at that point, the aggro hasn't been broken yet. In order for the enemies to fully break aggro, there has to be enough distance made between them and the player. If that requirement isn't met, the enemies will re-aggro onto the player and begin chasing him once again. Like here. Even though the enemies are outside of my aggro bubble, in this situation they re-aggro onto me as soon as I stop moving. Although when I put enough distance between me and them before I stop, they break successfully. Another way to break aggro is to suddenly put a lot of distance between you and the mob. You can achieve that by the use of a long distance shadow step, like for example Shadow of Haste or Recall. Like here I break aggro of all the currently surrounding me enemies by cancelling Shadow of Haste, which I previously used in this area. Using a short shadow step like Death's Church, Hoss, or Vipers usually doesn't put enough distance between you and the mobs for them to stop chasing you. Although if you use those skills to jump over a wall or an obstacle and there's no easy way for them to get around to you, it might result in a successful aggro break. In order to make sure that it is successful and break aggro completely, the player is required to keep moving after performing one of the short-range shadow steps. Otherwise, the mobs might still follow. A perfect example of abusing this mechanic to your advantage is during glitching skellies as T3 in pits. The player uses Shadow of Haste in the center area of pits, and after using a shadow step over a wall, he stands still or moves sideways or backwards, not reaching the 33% movement speed threshold, which would break aggro of the skellies, makes them follow him instead, and leads them under the bridge. Next, when Shadow of Haste ends, the aggro of skeletons is broken, leaving them glitched. On the final note about breaking aggro, it's important to remember that all of the mentioned ways of breaking aggro always involve combining distance and movement. That's why every time after using a shadow step, even a long distance one, the player should keep moving in order to successfully break aggro. How to resolve shared aggro? Once aggro is shared, it stays that way. It cannot be broken by one of the players simply running away. All the players sharing aggro must break it at the same time using the previously listed ways of breaking aggro. Otherwise, it will stay shared. In this clip, I share aggro of the Wailing Lords with the T3. Next, I attempt to break it by running away, which fails, because the T3 still has their aggro. Only when we both run forward at the same time, the Wailing Lords finally break. Shared aggro cannot be broken by distance. Even when the player sharing aggro runs outside of compass range of the enemies, they consider me as their only target only temporarily. As soon as the player comes back in range, the enemies go back to the shared state and begin to split between us. Another way to deal with shared aggro is to simply die. Dying gets rid of aggro completely. When only selected players want to lose aggro of enemies, this option is particularly useful. That way, the person tanking mobs gets to keep their aggro without the need to break it first at the same time with everyone else, like it is required by option 1. That's why you shouldn't be surprised if your team members tell you to die if you unintentionally share aggro. Sometimes they might not even be referring to dying in game, as the Underworld community is known to be a little bit toxic, but that's beside the point. That will be it for this guide. I hope I explained everything fairly clearly, and if not, leave a comment or message me in game. The next guide is going to be much shorter, and it's going to be about wall blocking. Special thanks to Jamie, Frida, Justy, and Casper for their willingness to participate in the making of some of the clips you've seen in this guide. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.